Yeah, guys, can you see my screen?
No.
Yeah. No.
ठीक
This no vacancy.
ठीक okay ठीक है I'm assuming you guys have empty Angular app setup. ठीक है so
Yes.
I'll yeah mine is still installing in modules. Give me a second. So I'll just walk you through what we would be covering today. So see, everyone knows of routing. So Angular JS we have done routing. In mobile app also we have done routing. And what it essentially is basically mapping URLs to specific features, right? And doing stuff with that. But what does routing mean in the content? So normally what are routes? Routes are paths, right? So if you're going accessing a resource or something like that, you want a way to identify a particular resource, right? So assume you're making something related to maybe you have classrooms, right? How do you identify a classroom? It will be maybe you have a particular ID associated with the classroom, maybe you have a particular class name or section name or something like that. So, normally you would want something to identify that thing, and also you would want to identify that you're talking about a classroom. So, because if you're looking through a browser, you have to be able to identify a given resource and property specific to the resource, right, or data specific to that resource. So, and because the browser state is not it's not a consistent thing, right? So if I come over here and I reload the whole page, whatever is inside the context of the browser will disappear. Whatever I'm storing inside the JavaScript variable will disappear. The browser, the app which is running on the whatever is running inside JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever, will have to recalculate the current state again from the URL, right? So the routes and these things gives us a way to kind of store stuff directly on the URL. You can share it with other people. You can use bookmark it. So it gives a representation of a way for a part to access a certain resource. Right? So now I might be thinking maybe we can use local storage and stuff like this. But, local storage you can use for maintaining state of a particular given application. But local storage, so it's like local storage. So normally you would use certain resources for certain sets of things. Right? Normally you would not want to so URLs are a standard by which a particular resource is identified. Local storage is not something you use as a standard, or even session storage or you use them for storing certain forms of data, but you never actually use them for declaring which resource you have opened up. Okay, so now my application has initialized. I'll go inside the application and we'll start. So this is a completely new Angular application. This older one, so whatever I was going to cover today, I just made a very mini application with that, so that if I make any mistake or something, I have a working version to refer to. It's a bit of cheating from my side. Yeah, so this is a completely empty application, and we are starting from here. I think Arun is starting. Let's wait for this. Yeah. So, guys, try to follow along. Just start your application. We'll cover through a few portions. Okay. So, right now the application has only one thing, which is you have your first home, the empty page, and you have an empty routes. Okay. If your routes is empty, that is no path will be matched, right? And in the HTML page, if you want to use a router on a given HTML page or somewhere, you need to have access to a certain HTML tag, which is you need to use some particular HTML, which is called router outlet. Okay. Without router outlet, none of the paths or the components that you define get rendered. I'll explain what this is. Okay. So suppose I put a router outlet over here. This is app HTML. I want to identify app HTML, right? So let's call this app is here. And while the NG-sub is going on, let's do a few more things. Let's generate a few components over here. So yesterday, if you remember, I showed you how to create particular components. So so there is a shortcut syntax for creating components. So you do ng-gc, it's happening over here, ng-gc, and then I put the components in. you guys have any questions or getting blocked somewhere, feel free to turn on your mics and speak. Okay? So what would NGGC do? It will generate a component right here inside app folder. Okay. Right now I'm creating a component called home. Now let's create, you see the home component got created. I'll create another component. I'll name this profile. Okay. These are two routes that we kind of want to access. Okay. And we will map them to specific paths. Oh. I think App Studio is running in the beginning. Android Studio. Oh, it's export. Nice. Export is beautiful. It's like one app can. Export is beautiful. If you have export running in the background, it will like slow down your entire system. Probably heavy enough to slow down your, like, if someone is viewing this in their system. Someone do something. Export is not good for RAM. Yeah. This is going on. I'll just put up stuff over here. Okay. So I made two components over here. Okay. These two are empty components which are generated right now using ng generate component or ngGC as a short. Okay. And then the component. So these two are empty components which got created by Angular CLI. Okay. Now I want to connect them to certain paths. Okay, from the base path itself. So app routing.module.ts, here I can put up the paths that I want, and these paths. So since this connects to the app component HTML, which is defined over here. So app module TSP, you have the bootstrap component. Bootstrap component is the component which is loaded first. Okay. Normally you wouldn't have to define bootstrap in any other portion, but it has to get defined over here because this is the entry point. Okay. So the app component gets loaded. In the app component, you have the router outlet. This router outlet for the tag would get replaced by whatever tag you define over here for the given path. Okay. So if we define a path as home and correspondingly bad, someone thinking? Okay.
No. I just joined.
Okay. So right now, I'll just I'll just quickly go through. We created an empty Angular application and we only added these two components. Okay. We haven't actually done anything other than this. Okay. And what is happening over here is so I'll quickly run through what has happened till now. So if you look at the app module TS, this is of the base component which was created for the first time. The first, the external outside, most outside module is app module. Here you have to provide something which is called a bootstrap. It's already done by Angular, but still good to understand. App component, this is the entry point of the entire application. Okay? And this is the portion which gets loaded first. Okay? This app component is used inside index.html if you have the app tool. Okay? Which is this thing. This app tool thing. Okay? And yeah. And we want certain things to route inside this app component HTML code. Okay. So we have the app is here and we have the corresponding router outlet. Okay. So we want to, so given a particular path, maybe like say localhost 4200/home, I want it to access the home walla portion. The app is here walla portion, but since this portion I haven't provided, I haven't saved this yet, the paths are not provided. So it's just rendering this portion and the router outlet is empty. Okay. Now you would want, if I want, I'm going to put up two paths. One is home and the other is profile. This is being done in the app routing module. The app routing module is connected to app module TS. This is by default. This is already by default, like provided by Angular. But when we will come to creating separate modules, we'll see how this thing gets created. For if you want to create something of your own. Okay? So I'm doing profile something. Profile. Okay. So right now, if I write home now over here, you'll see its app is here, home works. And now if I write profile, you'll see this two works. But there's an interesting thing to see over here. Localhost photos profile. If you deploy this will break. Okay. The reason behind photos profile, unless you actually render each page, like if you do, unless you do server-side rendering, these are not actual paths. Okay. These are kind of paths emulated inside the Java browser environment. But these paths do not normally exist. Right. So normally UI wala paths you would want to keep like in a pattern like this. Okay. Which is currently what we do in our current web app also. Okay. So what Angular does by default provides the like skips on the hash. You have to manually put it in. How do you do that? You come to app module TS and you have to provide a strategy for this to use. Okay. So you do provide location strategy and this would be used plus hash. I'm going to make it very dependent on autocomplete. It is kind of irritating with that also. The hash location strategy. Okay. If you use this, you'll see once we reload this whole page, you have to now, if you have that, you can go to home right now and just be directly inside the browser. You'll see the whole page does not reload. Okay. It will only be the portion inside the router outlet which reloads. Okay. And this is the kind of format you normally want to keep unless you're doing server-side rendering. Okay. So this is kind of how you create like two paths. Now the question comes, if you want to have a default path, maybe like an empty path, and when you access that empty path, you would want to access like home, right? So you will put an empty code here. You will do so now. An extra thing you have to put in terms of empty path, because this is kind of done using rejects, right? So if you don't get this path match, it will not exactly match up to any route. It will always resolve over. Okay. So you want only if this portion of the path is empty, you'll go for you'll redirect to the home column path. Okay. So what I'm doing is that if I get an empty path, then I'll redirect to home. Okay. Now suppose if I remove this, enter, it will redirect me automatically. This is all the stuff that you can do. Okay. Now, maybe now the thing comes is, how do I pass parameters between pages? So, suppose I have a profile over here. So there's some noise coming from the background. Okay. So suppose I want to, it's not just profile you want to pass, you also want to pass the name of the particular user. So it won't ever be just profile, it will always be profile and plus some name. Okay. So if I now try to access profile, it doesn't work, right? But if I do profile / something, you see the profile page loads up right now. But how do I access it? How do I access this thing? So I come to profile, component HTML. Sorry, I think this was not the one. This is profile on the different other application of different ones. Yes. over here, now I want to access the name and display it somewhere on the page. Okay. How do I do that? In Angular, if you want to access something from the URL, you want to use something called activated route. Okay. So this is dependency injection happening over here. It's the same as Angular says. It's a bit more verbose, but it's essentially the same as Angular says. So to activated route, it's technically kind of the stat params with a few more extra stuff. Okay. So you get activated route. Now see, there is a kind of a thing catch over here, that is in case if you want the name to come up over here, you wouldn't want to access it directly from activated route, but you would want to access it through a snapshot of the activated. Okay. I think in the newer versions of Angular, there is something like activated route snapshot which you can directly inject. But I think you can still do it via this way. It doesn't matter that much. So activated route dot snapshot. This is a snapshot in time that when this method gets called, whatever is there in the URL gets processed, right? So if you don't do this, the other thing you would see that if you directly try to access params over here, you see params is observable. That means you have to subscribe to it or do piping or something. Normally you wouldn't want that, because you want the URL to be present, or if you don't want to do something inside your subscribe or do piping just from it, right? So snapshot would be okay. Then to access the params, and then the what did I put over here? I put name, right? So, name. And let's take this. Take the name, and we'll put it here. So whatever I type over here, I have to press enter 2 times. Yes. This is also an interesting thing to see. If I change something over here and press enter, nothing would happen. But if I select this and press enter again, then it works. Why is this? The reason is this because in Angular, the initialization happens when the component is loaded. It's not when something changes. Okay. So this is a very interesting thing, because in other places like in Angular JS, you will see if you change something in the URL, normally that portion, the components which are related to it get reinitialized. That is that reset functions or init functions would get, but it doesn't happen in Angular. If the component is loaded, the init function is already executed. If you want something else to trigger, you would want to use some other lifecycle hook like ng on change or something like that. Okay. There are a bunch of lifecycle hooks. Just check the Angular docs; you will have them over there. Because a few of them only are very use case specific, and it makes sense to like check the docs out and actually talk them. So, yeah. Anyway, so see, one interesting observation you might make. Okay, I have the profile page over here. I have the home page over here. In our application, what we do is we make auth settings available everywhere. Right? People are able to access it directly from the constructor. They are able to access it from any page. The user details is also something that you would want to access from anywhere. Right. So how do you do this? How do you create kind of like so how do you create a function which resolves and then all the routes load? Okay. You want a global way to actually load up this data and make them available everywhere without always doing a subscription everywhere, right? So how do you do that? So the concept is called a resolver. Okay, I'll just, so if you look up resolvers, see, I actually have the code over here. Let's take it from this. So this is what a resolver is. Okay. So a resolver is essentially something you can plug in anywhere. Okay. A resolver, you have to just implement a class meta class called resolve, where you would put in the return data type. It has access to the current activated route as well as the state of the snapshot. You don't have to understand what this is, but you have access to all of the patterns which are there in the URL. Okay. And based on that, you can return a promise, an observable, or anything. That is, you can technically make an API call over here and return that. Okay. And if the API call is cached, it would essentially have no loading there. It will just get returned right then and there. Okay. So this way, instead, so suppose you're opening a view expense page or an edit expense page, you would always want to load up the expense before accessing the page, right? It makes no sense to open up the page, load the data again. You would have to write the same line over and over and over again. You can technically create a resolver and just put that in the resolver. So let's create a resolver right now, right here. For the new application, let's create a resolver over. Let's create a folder over here for resolver. Okay. And let's call this. I won't be creating a very observable site. Achha, let's do this in observable form. The capitalize resolver dot ts. Okay. Now in the site capitalize resolver ts, I ideally want a resolver. So let's just copy over the syntax from here. I don't know to write. So ideally, you can find this inside Angular documentation. Let's call this capitalize resolver. Now I would have to do all the imports. Yeah. Okay. Now whatever the param name is there in the URL, I would want to capitalize it, or let's not capitalize, just make it uppercase. Okay. And so I remove the exclamatory sign towards here. Okay. So what is happening over here? Over here, I am taking the name out of the URL, and I'm essentially converting it to uppercase, and then passing them in off. What off does? Off converts whatever you pass inside it into an observable. Okay. So if you have worked with Angular before, what are observables? Observables are very similar to promises, with the catch that in promises you can do a then block inside a then block. Also in the case of observables, you can do a subscribe inside a subscribe block, but it's not a recommended practice. Like similar to like the promises, it's not a recommended practice to do a then inside a then. But in promises, you can chain a bunch of thens. Okay. In the case of observables, or you cannot do that. Once you subscribe, that's the end. Okay. It's very similar to promises. We'll come to RxJS and then we'll discuss observables in more detail. Right now, just think observables as the same as promises. Okay. You don't have to differentiate them right now. Okay. So I've created a capitalized resolver over here. So how do I attach it? I want to attach it over here because the name parameter is only available here. So I can put up resolvers, resolve, and resolve name uppercase name. Okay. Uppercase name, I want that resolve. Okay. Capitalize resolve. Now what would happen over here is that the capitalized resolver would be called every time this page is accessed, and it will check the data from the route and make the corresponding data available over here. Ideally, you would want to do all sort of transformations inside resolvers themselves if the page requires it so. The good thing about this is you can kind of plug and play as many resolvers as you want. You no longer have to put the logic in every single page now you work on. It becomes statically available. It's actually very nice to have. Okay? So I put up the capitalized resolver over here. And normally you should only use this for cache data, because non-cache data will create a latency when you're clicking a button or something like that. Okay? So right now let's see what is happening. So right now you won't see a difference over here, but let's do one thing. Let's come to the profile page. Profile page means you're accessing this thing, right? So the way you access, so let's look at the snapshot, what is there inside the snapshot. That way we can see what would be, how we access the data from inside the result. Everything which comes, the data, whatever comes from the resolver is always available inside the snapshot. Okay. But remember, this is not dynamic. It's not like if you have an observable, it will get resolved every time you get the data as a stream inside the snapshot. Whatever is loaded during initialization of this page, you will only see that. Okay. So let's see what comes up in the console. reload. Okay, we already have it. Okay. So you see, inside the parameter for data, you have the uppercase name. Okay. And it follows the same style that we have put inside this resolver for the portion. Sorry, not here. My bad. Here. So if you wanted uppercase name, lowercase name, like I don't know, space case name, or underscore snake case level name, you can technically do this all of them in the resolver stage only, and you can have the data ready in your hand in this portion, right? So you see how this makes a lot of sense for things like auth settings, for things like for if you're doing both view expense, create expense, and those pages, you would always have a transaction. You will mostly, not always, you will mostly have a transaction which you want to access. But edit expense and view expense will always have data associated with it based on a URL. Okay. Create expense couldn't, obviously, but edit expense and create or view expense would always have. And permissions are also impose a very interesting thing that you can like resolve permissions directly in the resolver level. And the most interesting thing is you don't so I'll come to that the other portion once we could reach that portion. Okay, let's just replace this data dot what we will see in the name of uppercase. Okay. You'll see that every time the page loads, you're getting properly resolved data or something like that. Right? So this is transformed data of whatever we are getting from the user. You can essentially be doing a API call in the midst while this is getting loaded, right? So it's one of the more interesting things. Resolvers, they provide a way to actually cut down a lot of content in each of your components or each of the parental components. Okay. So this goes for a resolver. The other thing you would want to use are called guards. Okay. So there is a very easy way to actually create a guard. So what is a guard? Okay. So you have paths over here. Okay. So suppose I want to restrict that you can only access profile name pages when the name starts with A. Okay. Other pages you want to other accesses you want to restrict. That is, if a person's name not starts with A, suppose it contains A. In other places, you want to restrict them and reroute them to a certain other page altogether. Okay. What is the similar scenarios you already know, right? Which has which also happens in the current web app. One of them is if the user is not logged in. You do not want unauthorized users from accessing a particular group, right? If a user does not have permissions, that is, if he doesn't have the permissions to access a certain page, there should be some guard protecting that particular page, right? So you can have a role-based guard, that is admin guard. So if the admin guard does not allow admin users from accessing that particular portion, he'll get redirected to a different page altogether. And the interesting thing is, like, you can combine a bunch of guards. Okay. It's not necessary that you only have to have one guard, but you can have multiple guards acting on the page. So how do you do that? Okay, let's ng generate guard. Ng generate guard. Let's call this name guard. Okay. It by default adds the name guard after this, so you don't have to write guard, and it becomes name guard. Yeah, that's kind of unnecessary in my opinion. Okay, guys, are you able to follow what I'm saying now?
Yes.
Can activate. So, okay. So you guys might have seen that there are four points which came up. So those are can activate, can deactivate, and a bunch of other things. So those are essentially guards. You can only create in context of what sort of thing it's guarding against. That is, it can be can activate guard, can deactivate guard, and stuff like this. Can activate means if this would be attached to a block which has sorry, not here. Over here. So over here, you have a bunch of hooks over here, that is can activate, can deactivate, and stuff like this. Okay. So so you can see the meaning of these things over here. Can activate means whether the particular component, if you can access it or not, or when this particular component is getting accessed, this guard would get triggered. Okay. If someone is leaving this page, this guard will get triggered. Okay. So these are the kind of things that guards help you do. Okay. So an interesting concept would be an like a form guard or something. So pages where you have forms, you would want to put a form guard to see that if any person is moving away from the page, maybe he clicked somewhere by default and he hasn't saved the data in that particular given page. Okay. So in that particular scenario, you would want to like restrict him. You would want to restrict him from like I know from moving out without saving the data, right? So can deactivate can be an interesting use case for that. Okay. Because you can check the state of the current pages form or something to be got somewhere. Anyway, so there are very similar interesting cases that you can look through for within this particular Guardswala implementation. And the best thing about them is you can combine a bunch of them to create more complex behaviors. Let's do the can activate over here, and inside can activate, I'll put the name. Inside name guard, I want to check if the particular name is has an A on it. Okay. How do I access that? I can access them via the activated root snapshot. Okay. Or you can so it essentially would be this dot next. Sorry, my bad. It won't be this. It will be next dot params dot name dot lowercase into this is TypeScript, so you have access to all of these things over here. Which is actually okay. So you want the page which is getting accessed where name guard is present to have a param called name which has a name. If it doesn't happen, it will. So if it doesn't return true, that page won't resolve. But normally you wouldn't want them to get stuck on the given page. It does seem like the page is not changing, right? So what you want to do essentially is to redirect them to a different page. So you give return true over here. And else, now I want to re-navigate them to a different page altogether. Did someone think something? This router is another interesting thing. So router you use to navigate from one page to another. It's basically the same as state. Okay. We used to do state.go. Now we do this.router.navigate. Nothing. Okay. And it has a stylistic approach to actually writing paths. Like you can normally write normal paths. I prefer doing it in a syntax which is like this. So it is like this. Okay. So the first slash implies is starting from base. Okay. So this means that anytime this is not this turns to be false, I'm going to redirect them to home. Okay. In app, you want to check if the token is present there. If the access token is not present at all, you would want to you'll want to redirect them to the sign up page or signing page like depending on the app you're working. Okay. So I have the name guard present over here. We should restrict people from accessing profile page without a name which doesn't have E. Let's see if this works. Okay. Let's add a few more things over here and let's reload this. It's giving access. Maybe now I turn up with the name which is on the previous. You see, I got redirect back to home. This is how the whole Guardwala thing works. It would prevent you from accessing that page at all if you have the guard in place. Okay. And this gives rise to a very interesting. So you have now the the tools over here right now to create a more or less functioning app with proper routes, proper variables getting passed and stuff like that. Okay. Now the interesting question comes up. Hmm, uh, if you want lazily loaded modules, how to do that? Because suppose if you look at File Lab, you'll see like the whole application is super large, right? You have like maybe 100 routes, 200 routes, 300 routes, 300 different distinct pages, right? And if when an individual filer, suppose the most popular user, the user who uses our application the most has the role filer. Okay, 90% of our users are filer, even more, I would say. So when these users open the application, they necessarily do not open the admin side, right? It's a given. Most of the users are only filers, and they wouldn't ever open the organization portion of the application. But still, the JavaScript is getting loaded into the UI file. And now admin side is also huge, right? If you look at settings, the settings portion doesn't get loaded because we have the micro frontends wala thing. But there are, so if the user is already logged in, and if it's one single application, it makes no sense to load a lot of portions, right? Corporate credit card wala portion, trip request wala portion, advanced request wala portion. Maybe a normal filer, maybe 90% of the users do not even use these things. These are here to cater to a new bunch of the users, a new bunch of the users, and when they want to access this, then we can load up the JavaScript. That should be the ideal way, right? You don't. So if the whole application is like 300 kilobytes or maybe 1 megabyte in size or JavaScript files, if instead of pulling in one whole megabyte, if we can split this into 200 kilobyte files, where the essential 200 kilobyte gets loaded first, and then we kind of load the later modules as and when required, that would be much better, right? It solves a major problem about the website loading up speed getting slow. Okay. So, and in our application, this might not seem the ठीक है कुछ 300 KB users would wait. Okay. But this becomes a problem when you're creating for users who need very high speed like loading time. Maybe you're building an e-commerce application or something. Okay. Where every millisecond of latency matters, because that would mean the difference between a conversion and non-conversion. Yeah. So ideally, you would want to keep performance as good as possible, because performance is something which is very vital in terms of even business applications. Because earlier, older business applications, they used to be very clunky. But one of the best things about our company, as well as a lot of newer companies, is because we pay attention to these things, right? And performance is something which is a deal breaker for many companies, for many users. Okay. So how do we do this? How do we create a portion of our application that loads up based on requirement and doesn't load up always? Okay. The first step in doing that is creating what we call is called a lazily loaded module. Okay. Now the question comes, what is a module? A module represents a specific homogeneous chunk of your application. These are huge words. What does that mean? By a module, you would say it represents a domain. Okay. Expenses reports, it's a domain. Cards and corporate credit cards, it's a domain. Ships, it's a domain. Advanced, it's a domain. It's like a chunk of the application which you can call a single whole, which might have dependencies or other portions, which might be connected to other portions, but to a very small degree than portions inside the same domain. Okay. So the amount of like correlation you have with create expense and view expense and my expenses space is much higher than create expense and advanced request for the page. Okay. Or my expenses to advanced request. An expense may still be connected to an advance. Okay. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a high degree of correlation over there. Okay. It's something which is there but might not be there. So you understand the how we specify particular modules. It kind of depends on the business scenario. Okay. And domain, if you guys have read, so a bit of literature, if you want to read on how these sort of concepts are come up, how we will come up with these sort of distinctions, read about domain-driven design. Domain-driven design is something which we used to do earlier on in older applications, because only monolithic applications used to be present at that time, and people needed a way to actually like like navigate the whole the huge applications in a certain way that certain domains do not overlap, right? So from that the concept comes up, because even if you look at Angular applications or any other sort of application, you will still see that level of like cohesive. There are certain portions which work need to work together, and certain portions which kind of are linked together, but the amount of coordination is comparatively lesser. Okay, I've been ranting for 5 minutes straight. I will come to that. So how do you, the first thing is creating a module. Okay, so you go to ng generate module. Okay, these are all short forms. Ideally, you can do generate module, but I'm lazy that way. Okay, and another thing you would want to put is dash dash routing equal to true. Okay, another thing you would want to put before actually committing with this is dry run dash dash dry. Okay, and I'm sorry, my bad. I have to put in the name of the module over here. Okay, let's call this lazy level. So I will call this lazy. Okay, dry run wouldn't actually create the files, but it will show you how the path of the files which would get generated. It would be very easy to understand like where what paths are getting created, what is getting created if you have. See, okay. So you see in source.app, it will create a folder called lazy. It will put a large routing module ts and large module ts, these two files. Okay. Now, once I have confirmed okay, these are the files I'm creating, I'll just create this. Okay. Now, if you want to put some extra portion, now you probably would want to add a few more portions inside LSD, right? You would want components specific to LSD. That is fast. Maybe for trips, you have view trip, you create trip, my trips, etc. Okay. How would you do that? You would do ng generate component same as before, and then you have to keep the folder name LSD slash LSD. Let's call this LSD1. We'll create three copies LSD1, LSD2, LSD3. Every time I'm planning that I'll have these sessions for 20 minutes and I'm going over 1 hour.
Okay. Ayush Bhaiya,
Uh,
these methods weren't present in Angular 6 or 7, no? ये नया है शायद जो lazy loading के मैं automatic.
Lazy load, no. Lazy loading was so lazy loading automatic. So see, lazy loading was there from Angular 4 on. I know this because the first company I worked in, they used to do lazy loading. Okay. The syntax was different. Okay.
Okay.
So after about that syntax still compatible, but the syntax it was present. Lazy loading was present, available from Angular 4 or 6. I'm not sure, but it was available
No,
from earlier.
हाँ वो present था because I also use this. But the thing was मैंने कभी ऐसे नहीं बना था, मतलब मॉड्यूल बना के मतलब मैनुअली करते थे, ऐसे नहीं पता था कमांड लाइन से होता है.
Oh, अच्छा. You mean the CLI वाला thing?
Yes,
CLI
yes.
में अच्छा. I don't remember. CLI में तब था कि नहीं, I don't remember. Okay. So let's let's plug in the particular modules one by one. Let's plug in the first module. Let's call this 1, and component it would be LSD one component, and I will go with the 2. LSD 2 components. Okay. Now I have 2 components over here. Now I also have to be sure to always add this if your base path is never empty. That is that path, single source, path match. Remember, this is native paths which you're putting over here. Okay. So you would probably put LSD, maybe you'll put a parent level LSD over here, and you want to, it will become, the path will become /LSD/1. Okay. And it will redirect to Right now you created three, we created three paths, loaded paths. Now we want to load them up over here. Okay. Now let's create a path for lazy as lazy. Okay. Now see the syntax you have to put over here for loading Lazily loading module is load children. Yeah. Load children you have to put in a function. This function will end up in an import, and this import you have to target this module, the module you want to lazily load. Okay. Lazy slash module. You're losing load. So what is happening here? You're passing inside load children. You're passing in a function which will load up the module. Okay. So whenever this path gets getting resolved, you're kind of executing a function to load up more JavaScript, which is which is happening over here. Earlier on in older Angular, they used to have a syntax like this: LZ module. Other thing would happen if Dupati might recognize this. In older Angular, we used to do this. In the newer versions of Angular, this is no longer required. You can directly kind of have this promise for the syntax. Okay. So okay, now the interesting thing to see, right now we are at home, right? So we not home, I mean. So now see, I'm showing only JavaScript for the loads over here. Okay. Now I'll come to LSE. Remember, this is after hash, so the whole page never gets loaded. You see, now new JavaScript got loaded, and the size of this is about 10 KB. Given the only two components with one line each, this is 10 KB. You can understand how a particular module with 100 elements can easily scale up to 2 MBs or 3 MBs if you use a lot of libraries too. Okay, so you're essentially saving this 10 KB when you're only accessing the home. Okay, so if I write home now, you'll see no JavaScript got loaded. But if I reload the whole page, all of the JavaScript gets loaded. So you understand, like, I'm not exactly loading up all of the JavaScript at first, but I'm loading JavaScript. This is loading up actual files from the server. Okay, it's not loading in like data and stuff. And this becomes very interesting because you tend to speed up the load time of the application to quite an extent. Okay, now this is one way of doing this thing. Now, one question you might come up with, okay, this is all nice and good, but suppose I have a case like this. I have a Auth Wala parent module. I have a main enterprise Wala module, and I have a settings Wala module. That settings Wala module needs a layout Wala component as the outside, and it needs another router outlet on the inside. Okay. This is a very common scenario because you would want multiple layers of things. So you would want nested router outlets. Like we had the router outlet over here, you would want another extra router outlet inside. Okay. How do we do that? So I'll show you directly with the Lazily load component. So if you will, let's call this LZ layout. Okay. So this will create a new component directly inside LZ. Okay. This doesn't necessarily have to be inside a Lazily loaded module. This can be anywhere. Okay. I'm just doing this example because normally this is the scenario. In every Lazily loaded module, you would have a layout component or a wrapper component or something. Okay. And mind you, another interesting thing is like this approach works only for Angular. In Ionic, you cannot repro the same thing. Okay, because Ionic has a very funny thing happening with its whole Ionic router thingy. It doesn't allow you to do nested router outlets, or like they made it unnecessarily complicated for which when I could not figure it out. So we want our path to be empty. We want the component, the parent level component, which would be LZ layout component, and all the children, all these two components to be like children of this open, right? Let's start the So how do you add children? You have to write children. And now inside Laz layout component.html, you can add a router of the tool. Someone joined it.
Hey, no, I joined again.
Sorry. So if you look at this now, you'll see the layout, the outside wala app is here is from here. Okay. This outside wala thing you can see. Inside that, this layout wala component, this thing got rendered. And this router outside again got replaced with Laz1. If you put 2 over here, you'll see the second wala component getting replaced inside the layout. Okay. So this is all I know about routing and all I could find about routing. So this is about it for today's session. Okay. Do you guys have any questions you want to like throw something? Are you guys even there?
हाँ.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do you guys have any questions or something?